The Hells Angels biker found the little girl studying a torn photograph in the old church, and the message behind it exposed a family crime. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It all began on a cold autumn evening, when Jake Morrison, a Hells Angels biker with years of rough roads behind him, found himself riding alone through the countryside. His bike's engine roared as he cut through the crisp air, but the piece of the road was soon broken when he spotted something unusual. A small, weathered church sat at the side of the road, its steeple crooked and its windows dusty with age. Jake had passed this place countless times before, but tonight something drew him in. As he slowed his Harley-Davidson, he noticed a little girl, no older than 8, sitting alone on the steps of the church. She was studying something intently, her small hands clutching a torn photograph. The photograph was old, faded, and torn at the edges, as though it had been through years of hardship. Her face was serious, eyes locked on the image as if searching for a hidden truth. Jake, ever the loner, knew better than to get involved. But something about her, her small, fragile figure alone in the darkness, her silence, made him stop. He dismounted his bike and walked toward her, his boots crunching the gravel beneath. "Hey there," Jake called out, his voice rough from years of living a life on the road. The girl looked up, startled, her eyes wide with fear. She quickly tucked the photograph into her coat and stood up, brushing the dirt from her skirt. "Are you okay?" Jake asked, his tone softer now. She hesitated, then nodded, but there was something about her hesitation that made Jake uneasy. "I was just looking at this," she said quietly, holding out the photograph for him to see. The image was of a man, older, with dark eyes and a stern face. But what caught Jake's attention wasn't just the photograph, it was the look on her face. She didn't seem like a child who had found an old family relic. No, there was something deeper, a knowing in her gaze that made Jake wonder if there was a story behind the torn edges of that picture. "Who's that?" Jake asked, his voice now full of curiosity. The girl bit her lip, reluctant to answer. But after a long moment, she whispered, "That's my uncle. But I don't think he's really my uncle. My mom says he's not, but no one talks about him." The words hung in the air between them, and Jake's instincts told him this was no ordinary photograph. Something was hidden in the past, and it had made its way to this forgotten church, into the hands of this little girl. "What's the story with the photo?" Jake asked, kneeling down to her level. The girl looked around nervously, as if expecting someone to appear out of the shadows. "I don't know all of it," she said, "but my mom used to hide it. I found it in the attic. She always said it was a family secret, but she never told me why." Jake studied her face, sensing there was more she wasn't saying. There was a tension in her words, a fear that ran deeper than the mystery of the photograph. He stood up slowly, offering a hand to the little girl. "We should get you somewhere safe," he said. The girl looked at him for a moment, then nodded, slipping her small hand into his. As they walked toward his bike, Jake's mind raced. What family secrets lay buried in that old photograph? And why was it so important to this little girl that it had brought her here, to this forgotten church in the middle of nowhere? The answers, Jake knew, would not be easy to find. But one thing was certain. This was just the beginning of a story that would uncover more than anyone could have imagined. The little girl's hand trembled slightly in Jake's, but her grip remained firm. As they walked toward his bike, the distant roar of the Harley seemed to reverberate through the cold night air, cutting through the stillness of the abandoned churchyard. Jake looked down at her, trying to read her face, but it remained unreadable, a mask of fear and uncertainty. The photograph was now tucked safely in her coat, but Jake could feel the weight of its secret pressing down on both of them. What had she uncovered, and why was it so important? The ride to his place was uneventful, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The moonlight cast long shadows across the empty roads, and the hum of the engine was the only sound that accompanied them. Jake's mind was still racing from what the girl had said. "That's my uncle, but I don't think he's really my uncle." The words echoed in his head. Who was this man? Why had he been erased from her family's history? He pulled up to his place, a small, run-down garage on the edge of town. It wasn't much, just a warehouse converted into a workspace, but it had been home for the past few years. Jake had built it with his own hands, and it was the only thing he had left that felt like his own. He helped the girl off the bike, and they walked inside, the door creaking on its rusted hinges. The warmth of the garage hit them immediately, a contrast to the biting cold outside. He guided her to a seat on the old couch in the corner and turned on the small heater in the corner. "You should rest for a bit," Jake said, pulling off his leather jacket and hanging it on a nearby hook. "We'll figure this out." The girl didn't respond right away. Instead, she stared at the photograph, her small hands clutching it tightly. Her face was a mixture of confusion and determination. Jake couldn't help but wonder what was going through her mind. What had happened to her family? Why was she the one holding onto this torn piece of history? He knew that whatever the truth was, it wasn't going to be easy. He moved toward the workbench in the corner, grabbing a cup and pouring himself a drink. His hand was still steady despite the questions swirling in his mind. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked softly, not wanting to push her too hard. The girl shook her head, her eyes still glued to the photograph. "I don't know what it means," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I know it's important. It's the only thing I have left of him." Jake's heart sank. "Who is he?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The girl hesitated before answering. "His name was Michael. He was my mom's brother." She paused, the weight of her words sinking in. "But my mom, she never talks about him. She won't even say his name. It's like he never existed." Jake's mind was already working overtime, piecing together the fragments of the story. There was more to this than just a torn photograph. The girl had uncovered something, and whatever it was buried deep within her family's past. He set his drink down and sat across from her. "Do you know what happened to him?" he asked, his voice softer now. The girl nodded slowly. "I don't know the whole story," she said, her voice trembling. "But I overheard my mom talking to someone once. She was crying, and she said Michael had disappeared, that he was dead." She paused, her eyes welling up. "But no one ever said anything else. It's like they wanted to forget him." Jake leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "Do you think there's something more to it?" The girl's eyes locked with his. "I think he's still alive," she said, her voice filled with certainty. "I think he's out there, somewhere." Jake could feel a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just about a missing person. This was a story wrapped in mystery, with the kind of family secrets that people would kill to keep buried. Jake stood up, the weight of the situation sinking in. "We're going to get to the bottom of this," he said, his voice firm. The girl looked up at him, her eyes full of hope. "You'll help me?" she asked. Jake nodded. "Of course. We'll figure this out together." As Jake moved to the workbench, he glanced over at the old photograph again. The man in the picture, Michael, had to be the key to all of this. And Jake was going to find out exactly what had happened to him. But as he started to make plans, a sudden noise outside caught his attention. A car engine, the headlights cutting through the window. It was too late to hide now. Whatever had been buried was about to surface, and Jake wasn't sure if he was ready for what they were about to uncover. The noise outside grew louder, the car engines roaring as they pulled up to the front of the garage. Jake froze, his eyes darting to the small window near the door. It was a group of men, their figures barely visible in the dim light, but their presence was unmistakable. They were here. Jake didn't need to see their faces to know who they were. The brothers. The ones who had warned him about getting involved. The ones who didn't care about anything outside their world. And now they were at his door, ready to make sure he paid for his curiosity. The girl, sitting on the old couch, looked up, fear in her eyes. "What's happening?" she whispered, clutching the torn photograph tightly. Jake could feel her trembling beside him. He knew the situation had just gone from bad to worse. He stood still for a moment, trying to gauge the severity of the threat outside. The last thing he wanted was for her to be caught up in something she didn't fully understand. But he couldn't let them scare her. Not after everything she had already been through. "Stay here," Jake said, his voice firm but calm. "Lock the door behind me, and don't come out no matter what you hear." The girl nodded, but there was a hesitation in her eyes, a fear that Jake knew all too well. He didn't want her to be alone, but this wasn't something he could explain. Not yet. He stepped toward the door, his hand brushing against the old, weathered wood of the workbench. His mind raced, thinking of all the possible outcomes. He had lived through countless dangerous situations before, But this felt different. This wasn't just about the club anymore. This was about protecting a child who had already uncovered more than she should have. Jake reached the door and paused, his hand on the knob. He took a deep breath, then turned it, stepping outside into the cold night air. The headlights of the cars flickered on the wet pavement, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch into infinity. There were at least 5 men, maybe more, standing outside the garage, their eyes fixed on him. The leader of the group, a man named Viper, stepped forward, his boots clicking against the concrete. "Jake," he said, his voice cold, "you've made a mistake." Jake stood his ground, his arms crossed over his chest. "I'm not afraid of you, Viper," he said, his voice steady. "But you're about to make a big one." Viper smirked, his eyes narrowing. "You think this is about you?" he said, his tone mocking. "No, Jake. This is about her." He pointed toward the door of the garage, where the girl was still hidden inside. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know how they had found out about her, but he wasn't going to let them use her against him. "I don't care what you think you know," Jake said, his voice low and dangerous. "You leave her out of this." Viper laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "You really think you can protect her, don't you?" he said. "You don't even know what you're dealing with." Jake clenched his fists, his muscles tensing. He had made it this far without backing down, and he wasn't about to start now. "What do you want?" he demanded. "Why don't you just tell me what the hell is going on?" Viper's face darkened. "You're in deeper than you think, Jake," he said. "You've uncovered something that wasn't meant to be found, and now you're going to pay the price for it." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. The last thing he wanted was to drag this girl into a war that wasn't hers. But it was too late for that now. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, and the picture was uglier than he had imagined. "What are you talking about?" Jake demanded, his eyes flashing with anger. Viper took a step closer, lowering his voice. "That photograph," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "It's not just a memory, Jake. It's evidence. Evidence of a crime that goes all the way to the top. And now you've got her caught up in it." Jake's mind raced. The photograph. The torn image the girl had found. It wasn't just a family secret. It was something much darker. Something worth killing for. "You're lying," Jake said, but the doubt creeping into his voice betrayed him. Viper shook his head. "I wish I were," he said. "But now that you know, you're a liability. And so is she." The weight of Viper's words hung heavy in the air, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Jake could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he refused to back down. "You won't touch her," he said, his voice firm. "I'll die first." Viper's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "We're past the point of no return, Jake," he said. "And so is she." With that, the men stepped back, ready to move in. Jake didn't wait for them to make the first move. He sprang into action, slamming the door shut behind him and rushing toward the girl. "We need to go," he said urgently, his eyes scanning the room for anything that could help. The girl's eyes widened, but she didn't ask questions. She trusted him, and that was all that mattered. Jake grabbed her hand and led her to the back of the garage, where an old exit door led out into the alley. But as they neared the door, a loud bang echoed through the building. They were already here. Jake cursed under his breath. He had to get her out, fast. "Hold on tight," he said, pushing open the door and pulling the girl into the cold night. The chase had begun. The alley was cold and empty, the only sound the rapid footsteps of Jake and the girl echoing against the brick walls. The chase had begun, but Jake's mind was racing faster than his legs could carry him. He pulled the girl close, his heart pounding in his chest as they dashed between the shadows. The roar of motorcycle engines filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. They were getting closer. He could feel the adrenaline surging, his instincts kicking in, but the weight of the situation didn't escape him. He was protecting her now, and that meant everything. The girl, still clutching the torn photograph in her hand, glanced up at Jake, her eyes wide with fear, but also determination. She was terrified, but she trusted him. She had to. He had no time to waste. As they reached the end of the alley, Jake spotted an old, rusty door leading to a warehouse on the other side. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, and right now, shelter was exactly what they needed. He pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly, and they slipped inside. The darkness was thick, but Jake's eyes quickly adjusted, scanning the room for anything that could help. The warehouse smelled of dust and old metal. and the silence inside was only interrupted by the sound of their heavy breathing. They moved quickly, ducking behind stacks of forgotten crates and machinery. "We have to keep moving," Jake whispered, his voice low. The girl nodded, her face pale but resolute. She was still clutching the photograph, her fingers tightly wrapped around the torn edges. Jake could see that it meant more to her than just a memory. It was the key to everything now. They stayed low, careful not to make any noise as they crept through the warehouse. Jake's mind was already working, calculating their next move. He needed to get them out of there, but every road he considered led to more danger. The club wasn't going to let them escape that easily. The sound of engines grew closer again, and Jake knew it wouldn't be long before they were found. He needed to act fast. Suddenly, the girl stopped in her tracks, her eyes locked onto something in the far corner of the warehouse. Jake turned to follow her gaze. In the dim light, he could barely make out a large, metal door. It was heavy and old, but it looked like it could lead to an exit. Without a word, Jake grabbed the girl's hand and made a beeline for the door. They had no time to waste. But just as they reached the door, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind them. They were too late. "Stay behind me," Jake ordered, his voice sharp. He could hear the men closing in, their footsteps growing louder. The girl stepped back, her face filled with fear. Jake's heart sank. He couldn't let her get caught. He had to protect her, no matter the cost. The men appeared in the doorway, their shadows looming large against the light from outside. Viper was at the front, his cold eyes scanning the room. "You think you can run, Jake?" Viper's voice was low, full of menace. Jake stood his ground, positioning himself between the girl and the men. "I'm not running," he said, his voice steady. "But you are." He moved quickly, his training kicking in, and in an instant, he was on the offensive. The first man lunged at him, but Jake was ready. He dodged the attack, his fist connecting with the man's jaw with a sickening thud. The man staggered back, but another rushed forward. Jake was faster this time, using his elbow to knock the man off balance before taking him down with a quick move. Viper stood back, watching, his eyes narrowed. "You're making a mistake, Jake," he said, his tone dark. "This isn't just about you anymore." Jake didn't respond. He couldn't afford to. The girl was still behind him, and that was all that mattered. But before he could react, the sound of more footsteps echoed from the doorway. 2 more men appeared, their faces grim. Jake's heart skipped a beat. There were too many of them. They were closing in, and he knew they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. The girl's breath hitched behind him, and Jake knew he had to get them both out of there. He turned to her, his face determined. "Run," he said. "Get to the door. I'll hold them off." The girl hesitated for a moment, but she didn't argue. She nodded, her face pale but resolute. She turned and bolted for the door, her footsteps echoing in the warehouse. Jake turned back to face the men, his fists clenched. He knew he couldn't take them all down, not like this. But he wasn't going to go down without a fight. Viper stepped forward, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "You think you're a hero, Jake?" he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You're just a pawn in a game that's bigger than you." Jake didn't flinch. "I don't care what you think," he said, his voice cold. "I'm not letting you hurt her." Just as the men closed in, there was a sudden loud crash from behind them. The door to the warehouse burst open, and Jake barely had time to react before the sound of motorcycles roared into the building. The brothers had arrived. The tide had shifted. The battle wasn't over, but Jake wasn't fighting alone anymore. The sound of roaring engines filled the warehouse, the deep growl of motorcycles flooding the space like a storm. Jake's heart skipped a beat as the men from the Hells Angels rolled into view. The situation had gone from bad to worse, but now, it felt like a twist of fate. They were here. They had arrived just in time to turn the tables. The group of riders entered with an intimidating force. Their leather jackets and patches were unmistakable. Their faces hard, but the look in their eyes was unmistakable. Loyalty, solidarity, and a willingness to stand with Jake, no matter the cost. Viper, who had been sneering at Jake, suddenly froze, his expression shifting from arrogance to wariness. He took a step back, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun at his side. The brothers were here, and they were ready for a fight. "Jake," one of the bikers called out, his voice booming across the warehouse. "Get your ass over here. We've got your back." Jake didn't hesitate. He was ready for this, but there was something more at stake now than just his own survival. He turned to the girl, who had been standing by the door, her face pale, but her eyes filled with resolve. "Go," Jake said urgently, gesturing toward the back exit. "Get out of here. Go find a safe place. I'll handle this." The girl's eyes widened with fear, but she nodded quickly. She turned and ran, her small form disappearing into the shadows of the warehouse. Jake's heart clenched. He hated sending her away, but it was the only option. She couldn't be in the middle of this fight. Not anymore. The bikers moved in a coordinated, fluid motion, circling around Jake and Viper. The tension in the air was thick, the sound of leather jackets shifting and the subtle clicks of weapons being drawn adding to the heavy silence. Viper's eyes darted between the approaching bikers, calculating. He knew the numbers were against him now. "You think you can just waltz in here and take over, Jake?" Viper sneered, his voice dripping with venom. Jake stood tall, his jaw clenched in determination. "You should have stayed away, Viper," Jake said calmly. "This ends now." The other bikers gathered around, their presence making it clear that Viper's days of calling the shots were over. They weren't just protecting Jake. They were protecting a bond that ran deeper than any club. Loyalty to one another was something the Hells Angels didn't take lightly. Viper took a step back, his hand tightening on his gun, but before he could draw it, one of Jake's brothers, Steel, a hulking man with a scar across his face, stepped forward. "Put it down, Viper," Steel growled, his voice low but filled with authority. "You don't want to do this." Viper hesitated, his gaze shifting to his men. They were clearly outnumbered. His eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, Jake saw the anger flash in his rival's face. Viper wasn't used to being cornered, but he knew when to cut his losses. "This isn't over," Viper muttered under his breath, his hand twitching toward his gun again, but Steel was quicker. With a swift move, Steel grabbed Viper's arm, twisting it behind his back, and pushed him to his knees. "You're not calling the shots here anymore," Steel growled. "You're done." The other men moved in, grabbing Viper's henchmen and forcing them to the ground. The once unstoppable group of thugs was now helpless. Jake stood tall, watching, but his attention was divided. The girl, where was she? His heart pounded as he scanned the room, but before he could make a move, he saw her. She was standing near the back exit, her small figure framed by the door. She hadn't run as far as he had hoped. Her wide eyes locked with his, filled with both fear and defiance. Jake's mind raced. She couldn't stay here, not with the danger still looming. He quickly made his way toward her, his eyes never leaving her. As he reached her, she didn't speak, but the look on her face said everything. "It's not safe," Jake said softly, his voice urgent. "We need to go. Now." She nodded without hesitation, and together, they made their way toward the back of the warehouse, leaving the chaos behind them. The Hells Angels had taken care of the immediate threat, but Jake knew that this was far from over. The photograph, the family secrets, it all pointed to something much larger, something darker. They weren't just up against Viper and his crew. There was more to this than anyone had anticipated. As they reached the back door, Jake paused, glancing back at the warehouse one last time. The brothers were handling things, but there was a storm coming. A storm that would take more than just muscle to survive. The girl was still looking up at him, her small hand in his, trusting him with everything she had. He couldn't let her down. "Not now. Come on," Jake said, his voice steady as he opened the door. "We're getting out of here." They stepped into the night, the sound of the engines fading behind them as the cold wind rushed past. But Jake knew that the real battle was just beginning. The night was cold and still, the wind whispering through the trees as Jake and the girl made their way down the back alley. The sounds of the confrontation in the warehouse faded as they walked further into the shadows. The girl, her small hand gripping Jake's tightly, kept her head low, her eyes darting nervously at every sound. Jake's mind was still racing. The danger wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The photograph she had found, the one that started it all, wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a key to something bigger. And Jake knew that if he didn't figure out what was hidden behind that photograph, they wouldn't be safe for long. As they reached the end of the alley, Jake turned to the girl, his expression serious. "We need to get to a safe place," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Do you know anyone around here who can help?" The girl hesitated, glancing up at him. "I don't think so," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't really know anyone. Just my mom." But her words trailed off, and Jake could hear the uncertainty in her voice. She was alone in this world, just like he had been once. Jake took a deep breath. "All right," he said, his grip tightening around her hand. "We'll figure this out together. But right now, we need to keep moving." They kept walking, their footsteps echoing in the quiet night, until they reached an old, run-down motel at the edge of town. It wasn't much, but it would have to do for now. Jake pulled the girl inside and headed to the front desk, where an old man with a thick gray beard sat behind the counter. "We need a room," Jake said, his voice firm. The man looked up from his newspaper, his eyes narrowing when he saw Jake's worn leather jacket and the girl beside him. But he didn't ask questions. Instead, he handed Jake a key. "Room 6, he muttered, as if he had seen it all before. Jake took the key and led the girl to the room. It was small and cramped, but it was clean enough. He locked the door behind them and turned to the girl. "Stay here," he said, his voice gentle. "I'll make sure no one follows us." The girl nodded silently, her eyes still wide with fear. Jake stepped out into the night, keeping to the shadows as he made his way around the motel. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The photograph, the family secrets, it was all connected. And whoever was behind this wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. Jake couldn't let that happen. He had to protect the girl. He had no choice. As he walked down the quiet street, he saw the faint glow of headlights in the distance. Someone was coming. Jake ducked behind a dumpster, his heart racing as he tried to get a better look. The car slowed as it passed, the headlights casting long shadows across the pavement. Jake could see the figures inside. They were looking for someone, and he knew exactly who. The car didn't stop. It kept moving, disappearing into the night, but Jake didn't relax. Not yet. He had to stay one step ahead. He headed back to the room, his mind focused on one thing: finding out what happened to the girl's family, and why it all started with that torn photograph. Inside the room, the girl was sitting on the bed, staring at the photograph in her hands. "You're safe here," Jake said, his voice calm but firm. "But we need to talk about this photo. It's important, isn't it?" The girl nodded, her eyes still fixed on the picture. "I don't understand it," she whispered. "I don't know why it's so important. But I know my mom. She never wanted me to find it. She never talked about him." Jake sat down next to her on the bed, his hand resting gently on hers. "You're not alone in this," he said quietly. "We'll figure it out together. I promise." The girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and fear. "Thank you," she whispered. Jake gave her a reassuring smile, but inside, his mind was already racing. He had to find out who that man in the photograph was, and why his family had kept him a secret. As Jake lay down on the bed, his mind raced through all the possibilities. The family crime, the photograph, the danger that was closing in on them. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Not now. Not when he had someone to protect. He closed his eyes, his thoughts still spinning. But the last thing he saw before sleep took over was the girl's face, her expression full of uncertainty. Tomorrow, he would start getting answers. Tomorrow, they would find out the truth. But for tonight, they were safe. For tonight, they had a chance. The morning came with a cold chill that seemed to seep through the cracks of the motel room. Jake woke up, his mind instantly focused on the task ahead. The girl was still asleep, curled up on the bed, her tiny body wrapped in the blanket he'd given her. The torn photograph lay beside her, its edges frayed from constant handling. Jake's eyes lingered on it for a moment, the weight of the mystery pressing down on him. He had to get answers, but he knew time was running out. The people after them weren't the type to wait. He stood up, stretching his sore muscles, and walked over to the small window. The street outside was quiet for now, but he knew better than to trust silence. Viper and his crew weren't done. They would come for them, and Jake wasn't about to let that happen. He had to figure out who the man in the photograph was, and why he was connected to the girl's family. But there were too many unknowns, too many questions left unanswered. As he turned back to the girl, she stirred, slowly waking up. Her eyes were wide and filled with confusion, the remnants of fear still clinging to her expression. "Are you okay?" Jake asked, his voice gentle but firm. She nodded, sitting up slowly. "I'm fine," she whispered. But Jake could see the uncertainty in her eyes. "We need to go," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "There's no time to waste. We have to get answers, and we have to get them now." She didn't protest, only nodded again, the weight of the situation settling in. She was too young to be caught up in something this dangerous, but here they were, running from people who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. Jake grabbed his jacket, slipped it on, and headed for the door. "Stay close," he instructed her as he stepped outside. The cool morning air hit him like a slap in the face, but it sharpened his focus. He could feel the tension in the air, the sense that they were being watched. He had no illusions about the stakes. This was no longer just about the photograph. It was about survival. They needed to find out what happened to the girl's family and why someone had gone to such lengths to erase that part of their past. They walked down the street, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the main roads where anyone might spot them. Jake knew they couldn't stay in the motel for long. The longer they were in one place, the more likely it was that someone would track them down. He had to find a way to get the answers they needed without drawing attention. As they passed a small cafe, Jake stopped, his instincts telling him to be cautious. He glanced inside, scanning the few patrons scattered at the tables. The place seemed ordinary enough, but it felt too quiet. There was a man sitting by the window, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, his posture rigid and unnatural. Jake's gut twisted. This wasn't just a regular customer. This man had been watching them. Without saying a word, Jake pulled the girl into the alleyway beside the cafe, his mind racing. "Stay here," he said, his voice low. "I'll be right back." The girl nodded, her face tense, but she trusted him. She had to. Jake stepped out of the alley, walking casually toward the cafe. He moved slowly, deliberately, his eyes never leaving the man by the window. As he got closer, the man didn't even glance up. It was as if he knew exactly where Jake was headed. Jake reached the door, pushing it open with a casual shove. The bell above the door jingled, the sound sharp in the otherwise quiet room. The man at the window finally looked up, his eyes locking with Jake's. There was no recognition, just a cold, calculating stare. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice smooth but lacking warmth. Jake leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "I think you know who I am," he said quietly, his tone hardening. The man didn't respond at first, just studied Jake for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. "I don't know what you're talking about." Jake's patience was wearing thin, but he didn't let it show. "I'm not in the mood for games," he said. "I know you've been following us." The man's eyes narrowed slightly, but he kept his cool. "I don't know who you think I am, but you're mistaken." Jake leaned in closer, his voice dropping lower. "If you're working for Viper, you're wasting your time. I don't care what you've been paid to do. You're going to tell me what you know about the photograph, and you're going to tell me now." The man's expression didn't change, but Jake could see the flicker of recognition in his eyes. The man knew exactly what Jake was talking about. "I don't know anything about that," the man said, his voice becoming more strained. "You're barking up the wrong tree." Jake didn't believe him for a second, but he knew pushing further would only make things worse. He stood up straight, glancing at the girl still hiding in the alley. "You'll regret it if you don't start talking," he said quietly, then turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving the man sitting there, his silence louder than any words could have been. As Jake returned to the alley, the girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear and curiosity. "What happened?" she asked softly. Jake met her gaze, his jaw tight. "Nothing yet, but we're getting closer." He didn't have all the answers, but he knew they were on the right track. They just had to keep moving, keep searching, and hope they could uncover the truth before it was too late. The day had barely begun, but the tension in the air felt suffocating. Jake and the girl had barely escaped the cafe, and now they were holed up in a small, dingy diner on the outskirts of town. Jake kept his back to the door, his eyes scanning the room, his instincts screaming that danger was still close. The girl sat across from him, fiddling nervously with the torn photograph in her hands. Her small fingers traced the edges, the same look of determination mixed with uncertainty in her eyes. Jake knew they were running out of time. The threats were closing in, and the answers they needed were slipping further out of reach. He needed to find out who that man in the photo was, and why the people chasing them were so desperate to stop them from discovering the truth. He leaned forward, his voice low but urgent. "We need to get to the old church. It's the only lead we've got left." The girl's eyes widened. "The church? Why there?" Jake nodded, his expression hardening. The man in the photo, Michael, must have known something. "The church, it's connected to him. We have to check it out." The girl hesitated but then nodded, her face set with resolve. She wasn't a child anymore. The situation had forced her to grow up fast, and Jake couldn't help but admire her strength. They finished their meal quickly, then headed back to the alley where Jake had left his motorcycle. The girl climbed on behind him, wrapping her arms tightly around his waist. As they rode through the empty streets, Jake's mind kept racing. He knew they couldn't stay in town much longer. Viper and his crew would be looking for them, and the longer they stayed in one place, the more likely it was that someone would find them. The old church was located at the edge of town, a forgotten place that had stood the test of time. It was a place where the past could no longer be hidden, and Jake knew it was the key to everything. As they approached the church, the atmosphere grew heavier. The building was weathered, its tall spires casting long shadows in the late morning light. The doors creaked as they pushed them open, revealing a dark, musty interior. The silence was thick, broken only by the sound of their footsteps echoing on the cold stone floor. Jake scanned the room, looking for anything that might give them a clue. The girl stayed close to him, her eyes wide as she took in the sight of the old church. "What are we looking for?" she whispered. Jake didn't answer immediately. His eyes were scanning the altar, the stained glass windows, the pews. He walked towards the back of the church, his boots scraping against the stone. There had to be something here. As he reached the back, he noticed a small wooden door, barely visible behind a thick curtain of cobwebs. He reached for the handle and pulled it open, revealing a narrow staircase that led down into the darkness below. "This is it," Jake muttered. He motioned for the girl to follow him. They descended the stairs slowly, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom of the staircase, they found themselves in a dimly lit room, the walls lined with old bookshelves. It looked like a forgotten storage room, filled with dusty boxes and old relics. But there, on the far side of the room, was a small wooden chest. Jake approached it cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew this chest held the answers they needed. He reached down and opened it, his fingers trembling slightly as he lifted the lid. Inside, he found several pieces of paper, old photographs, and a worn leather journal. He picked up the journal first, flipping through the pages until he found what he was looking for. There, in the faded ink, was a name. Michael, the man in the photograph. But the journal didn't just reveal Michael's name. It told a story. A story of betrayal, hidden secrets, and a family torn apart by a crime that had been buried for years. The girl stood behind him, watching with wide eyes as Jake read the journal. "What does it say?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake closed the journal and looked at her, his face pale. "Your family isn't what you think," he said softly. "This is bigger than just a missing person. This is about a crime that goes back generations. And your family is involved." The girl stepped back, her hand covering her mouth in shock. "No, that can't be true," she whispered. Jake reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. "I know it's hard to believe, but we have to face the truth. The people after us, they're protecting something. Something your family doesn't want you to know." The girl swallowed hard, trying to process the information. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake stood up, his jaw set in determination. "We keep going. We find out everything we can, and we bring it all to light. This ends now. We're not running anymore." Just as Jake was about to leave the room, a sound from above made him freeze. The creak of footsteps on the floorboards. Someone was upstairs. Someone had followed them. He turned to the girl, his expression hardening. "We need to get out of here. Now." The footsteps above them grew louder, and Jake's instincts screamed at him to move. He quickly grabbed the girl's hand, pulling her toward the narrow stairway that led back up to the main church. The room they were in was still shrouded in shadows, but the dim light that seeped through the cracks in the old stone walls told him they didn't have much time. He had hoped the journal would give them the answers they needed, but now they were running out of time. Whoever had followed them was getting closer. The girl's face was a mask of fear as she struggled to keep up, her small frame barely able to match Jake's quick pace. Her grip on his hand tightened, as if she knew the danger they were in. They reached the bottom of the stairs, and Jake paused for a moment, listening. He could hear muffled voices from above, but he couldn't make out what they were saying. He cursed under his breath. There was no way to escape through the front door without being seen. They had to find another way out. He scanned the room quickly, looking for any sign of an exit. His eyes landed on a small wooden door at the back of the church. It was almost hidden behind a pile of old furniture and church supplies, but it was their only chance. "This way," Jake whispered urgently. He motioned for the girl to follow him, and they moved quickly toward the door. Jake's heart was pounding in his chest as they reached it. He could feel the air growing colder as they moved through the narrow hallway behind the door. The walls were damp with age, and the floor creaked beneath their feet. It was clear this part of the church hadn't been used in years. The girl's hand was still gripping his, but her steps were getting slower. Jake glanced down at her. Her face was pale, and her breathing was shallow. She was scared. He couldn't blame her. She had already been through so much. "Keep going," he urged, his voice steady but full of urgency. She nodded, but there was a distant look in her eyes. Jake knew that this was more than just running from their pursuers. It was the weight of the truth catching up to them. He could see it in her eyes, in the way she held the photograph like it was a lifeline. He wasn't sure how much she understood yet, but she was about to find out a lot more. They reached the end of the hallway, where a small door led to a narrow alley outside. Jake pushed the door open slowly, the hinges squealing in protest. He stepped out first, looking around for any signs of movement. The alley was empty for now, but that wouldn't last. They needed to move fast. As Jake stepped aside to let the girl pass, he heard a noise behind him. The faintest rustling of fabric, the soft scrape of footsteps on the stone. He whipped around, his heart racing. A figure stepped into the dim light of the alley. Jake's hand immediately went to his waist, where the cold steel of his knife was sheathed. The figure took a step forward, and Jake recognized the face. It was the man from the cafe, the one who had been watching them. Jake's grip on the knife tightened, but the man held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to fight," the man said, his voice low and steady. "I just need to talk." Jake didn't lower his guard. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. The man hesitated before answering, his eyes flicking to the girl behind Jake. "My name's Lucas," he said, "and I'm not your enemy. At least, not the way you think I am." Jake was still skeptical, his mind racing. "Then why the hell were you following us?" he asked, his voice sharp. Lucas sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Because I'm trying to help. You don't know what you're dealing with." Jake's eyes narrowed. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with. The photograph. The family secrets. Viper and his crew." Lucas shook his head, stepping closer. "You don't know the half of it," he said quietly. "That photograph, it's more than just a memory. It's the key to something much bigger than you realize. Something you've already walked into." Jake took a step back, his gaze flicking between the man and the girl. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. Lucas took a deep breath. "I don't have time to explain everything. But if you really want to protect her, you need to listen. Your family, her family, they're tied to something that goes back decades. And they're not the only ones who want it buried." Jake didn't know what to make of the man's words. They sounded like a warning, but Jake had no choice but to trust. The instinct that had kept him alive all these years. "What do you want from us?" Jake asked, his voice low. Lucas looked at the girl, his expression softening. "I want to help you get the answers you're looking for," he said, his tone earnest. "But we have to move. Now. They're coming for you. And if we don't get ahead of them, it's over." Jake glanced back at the girl, who was still standing silently behind him, her eyes wide and filled with fear. He couldn't let her down. He nodded slowly, his mind made up. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "But if you're lying to me, I'll find out." Lucas nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I wouldn't expect anything less." Jake turned to the girl, his expression softening. "Stay close. No matter what happens, you're with me now. We'll get through this." The girl nodded, her grip tightening around his hand as they turned to follow Lucas down the alley. The truth was waiting, and Jake was ready to find it, no matter what it took. They moved through the alley quickly, Jake's senses on high alert. Lucas led them through a maze of side streets and hidden paths, taking them further into the less familiar part of town. Jake kept a firm hold on the girl's hand, his gaze constantly shifting between Lucas and their surroundings. He knew that time was slipping away and that someone would be on their tails soon. "Where are we going?" Jake asked, keeping his voice low. Lucas didn't turn around, but his voice carried over the wind. "There's a safe house. It's the only place we'll be able to figure this out without being found." Jake's mind raced. Safe house. He wasn't sure if he could trust this man, but right now, he had no other choice. The girl was counting on him. They kept moving, each step echoing in the empty streets. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced behind them every so often, but saw nothing. Still, the feeling gnawed at him. How do you know so much about all of this? Jake asked, trying to make sense of Lucas's involvement. Why do you care? Lucas finally turned his head, his face unreadable. Let's just say I've got a few debts I need to pay, he said cryptically. And, right now, you and the girl are part of the payment. Jake felt a twinge of unease. Was Lucas being honest? He wasn't sure, but he didn't have the luxury of questioning it too much. The girl beside him was still quiet, her eyes wide with worry, but there was a flicker of trust in her gaze. Jake squeezed her hand reassuringly. We'll get through this, he whispered. They reached the edge of a rundown warehouse district. It was quieter here, the kind of place where you could disappear into the shadows if you knew where to look. Lucas stopped in front of an old building that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The windows were boarded up, the door cracked open just enough for them to slip inside. Without a word, Lucas pushed the door open, revealing a dimly lit interior. In here, he said, stepping inside. Jake followed, keeping the girl close to him. The place was dusty and cold, but there was a certain familiarity to it, like a forgotten sanctuary. This is where we'll figure everything out, Lucas said, his voice carrying through the quiet space. This is where the truth comes to light. Jake wasn't so sure about the truth, but he followed Lucas into the back room, where a table sat with papers scattered across it. The walls were lined with shelves, some filled with old books, others with boxes of things that seemed irrelevant to what was going on. Lucas gestured for Jake to sit at the table, and the girl, still holding on to Jake's hand, took the seat next to him. You're not going to like this, Lucas began, his tone serious. But the family you're looking for? The ones who have been keeping this secret? They're part of something bigger, and it goes deeper than you realize. Jake's heart pounded. He was finally hearing the truth, or at least what Lucas was willing to tell him. What do you mean? He asked, his voice tight. Lucas didn't look at them, but instead began rifling through the papers on the table, pulling out several photographs and old documents. He placed them in front of Jake. Your family is tied to a network, a criminal operation that goes back decades. The man in the photograph, Michael, he wasn't just a member of the family. He was involved in something much darker. And they've been hiding it from you. Jake looked down at the photograph of Michael again. The man in the picture had a strong jawline, eyes that seemed to see right through you. But there was something more to his story, something hidden beneath that stern expression. This can't be true, Jake muttered, his mind reeling. Why would they keep something like this from me? Lucas looked at him now, his eyes hard. Because people like that don't want the past to come back. They buried the truth, Jake. And now it's rising to the surface. Jake felt the weight of those words settle over him. This wasn't just about protecting the girl anymore. It was about uncovering the past, revealing the secrets that had been buried so deep that even he hadn't been able to see them. What happened to him? Jake asked, his voice tight. Where is he now? Lucas paused, then shook his head. I don't know, he said. But I do know that whoever's behind this, they're dangerous. And they won't stop until they've erased every trace of the truth. Jake clenched his fists, his anger rising. He wasn't going to let them erase the truth. Not now, not when they were so close. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. What do we do now? He asked, his tone sharp. Lucas looked at him, his face hardening. We find the rest of the story. We dig deep. And we don't stop until we've exposed everything. Jake nodded, his resolve hardening. He wasn't going to let anyone, not Viper, not anyone else, stand in his way. The truth was waiting to be uncovered, and no one was going to bury it again. All right, Jake said, his voice low. Let's finish this. The girl, who had been quiet up until now, looked up at him, her face filled with uncertainty, but also a spark of hope. We're going to be okay, right? She asked. Jake looked at her, his heart softening. We will be, he said firmly. We're going to finish this, and we're going to get you the answers you need. Together. As they prepared to move forward, Jake knew the road ahead would be dangerous. But with the girl by his side, he wasn't afraid. They would uncover the truth, and they would make sure it saw the light of day. He would protect her. He would protect them both. The tension in the room was palpable as Jake and the girl prepared for what was next. The journal Lucas had shown them was filled with unsettling revelations, but there was one entry that stuck out above the rest. The mention of a hidden location, a warehouse that held the final piece of the puzzle, was their next step. It was risky, but it was the only lead they had. Lucas had warned them that the people behind the conspiracy were dangerous, And the more they dug into the family's past, the closer they were getting to the truth. Jake could feel the weight of the responsibility bearing down on him. He had promised to protect the girl, and now they were more entangled in this web of secrets than ever. "Are you ready?" Lucas asked, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. Jake nodded, his jaw clenched. "We have no choice." The girl, who had been quiet throughout the conversation, looked up at Jake with wide eyes, her hands still gripping his tightly. "What if we're wrong?" she asked softly. "What if this just makes everything worse?" Jake looked down at her, his expression softening for a moment. "We have to know the truth," he said, his voice firm. "We've come too far to turn back now. But no matter what happens, we're in this together. And I won't let anything happen to you." The girl nodded, though there was still uncertainty in her eyes. Jake turned back to Lucas. "Lead the way," he said, his voice carrying the weight of the decision. They left the warehouse, walking quickly through the alleyways toward their destination. The streets were quiet, too quiet. The calm before the storm. Jake's instincts told him they were being watched. He kept his pace steady, trying to remain composed, but his mind was racing. They were getting closer to the answers, but with each step, the danger grew more real. They reached the outskirts of the town, where the streets gave way to an industrial area filled with old, abandoned warehouses. The place looked like a ghost town, but Jake knew better. This was where the answers lay, buried in the past, waiting to be uncovered. Lucas led them to one of the larger buildings at the back of the lot. The door was locked, but Lucas pulled out a set of keys and unlocked it quickly. As they stepped inside, the musty air hit them. The warehouse was cold and dark, with stacks of crates and boxes piled up in every corner. It looked like no one had been here in years. Lucas flicked on a flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. "The final piece is here," he said, his voice low. Jake's heart raced as they walked deeper into the building. The place felt abandoned, but it didn't feel safe. He could sense that something was off. They stopped in front of a large metal door at the far end of the warehouse. "This is it," Lucas said, turning to Jake. "Everything you need is inside." Jake nodded, steeling himself. He wasn't sure what he was about to find, but he knew it would change everything. The girl stepped closer to him, her hand still gripping his. He looked down at her and smiled, trying to reassure her, though he didn't feel reassured himself. He reached for the door and pulled it open. Inside, the room was dimly lit, and the air was thick with dust. But what caught Jake's attention immediately were the rows of file cabinets and boxes stacked high against the walls. The place was filled with documents, photos, and old files, evidence of everything they had been looking for. Jake walked in, his eyes scanning the room. "This is it," he muttered to himself. He could feel the truth pressing in on him, and the weight of it was suffocating. The girl stepped inside, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. She wasn't sure what they were looking for, but she knew it was important. She was finally seeing the secrets that had been hidden for so long. "Start looking through the boxes," Jake said, his voice low. "We don't have much time." He began sifting through the files, his heart pounding as he opened one after another, scanning the papers. But most of them were too old, too faded to read. Then he came across one file that caught his attention. It was a small, worn folder, its edges frayed from years of handling. Inside, there were several photographs, old, black and white pictures of people he didn't recognize. But as he flipped through the photos, one stood out. It was a picture of Michael, the man from the photograph the girl had found. He was younger in this picture, but the resemblance was unmistakable. He wasn't just part of her family. He was connected to something far bigger, something dangerous. Jake felt a chill run down his spine as he flipped to the next photo. This time, it wasn't just Michael. There were other people in the picture, faces he recognized. Faces that had been erased from the girl's family history. The truth was starting to unfold, and with it, a dangerous realization hit Jake. The girl's family wasn't just connected to the past. They were part of something that had lasted for generations. Something that people would kill to protect. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he turned the page. This was no longer just about the girl's family. This was a conspiracy, and it reached farther than he could have ever imagined. He looked up at the girl, who had been standing silently by his side. Her eyes were wide with shock as she glanced at the photographs. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake closed the folder and looked at her. "It's the truth," he said quietly. "The truth we've been searching for." The room was silent except for the sound of their breathing, and Jake could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. The girl stood beside him, her face pale as she processed the photographs. She had just seen the truth, a truth that had been hidden from her for as long as she could remember. The past, her family's past, was no longer just a distant memory. It was a dangerous reality, one that had come crashing into her life with an unforgiving force. Jake's thoughts raced, his mind trying to piece together the fragments of the puzzle that had been slowly revealed. The photographs showed her family, but they also showed something else. The connections, the hidden alliances, the faces of people who had been erased from history, people who were not supposed to be remembered. The girl's family had been at the center of something far darker than anyone had imagined, something that had been buried for decades. "What does this mean?" the girl whispered, her voice breaking through the silence. Jake turned to her, his expression hard but understanding. "It means we're not just dealing with family secrets anymore. This goes deeper. Your family, your real family, is tied to something much bigger, and those who want to keep it hidden will stop at nothing to erase any trace of it." She looked down at the photograph in her hands, her fingers trembling as she clutched it tightly. "What happened to him?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "The man in the photographs, Michael." Jake knew the question had been hanging in the air since they first uncovered the photo, but now, it felt even more urgent. "I don't know," Jake said quietly, "but we'll find out." He could feel the weight of the words, the unspoken promise between them. He wasn't about to let anyone hurt her, not when they were so close to uncovering the truth. They had come this far, and Jake wasn't going to back down. Not now. The girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but also with the same quiet determination that had been in her voice when she had asked for help. "What do we do now?" she asked. Jake exhaled slowly, his eyes scanning the room one more time. The walls seemed to close in on them, the knowledge of what they had just uncovered suffocating in its intensity. He knew what had to be done. They had to confront the past head-on. "We go after them," Jake said firmly, his voice steady now, a resolve settling in his chest. "The people who are hiding the truth, they won't stop until it's buried again. We need to take the fight to them, expose everything. No more running. No more hiding." The girl nodded, her expression firming. Jake could see the trust in her eyes. She was ready as she could be. He could see it, the fear, but also the fire beneath it. She wanted answers. She needed answers. And Jake was going to make sure she got them. He stood up, his gaze shifting to the door. "We'll head to the place where it all began," he said, his mind already calculating their next move. "The old church. There's something there we missed the first time. It's where all the answers lie." The girl's brow furrowed. "The church again?" she asked. "What's there?" Jake turned to her, his voice serious. "The truth. The key to everything. And we're not leaving until we've got it." With a final glance at the photographs, he walked toward the door, the girl following closely behind him. As they stepped out into the cold night air, Jake could feel the tension rising. They were no longer just chasing answers. They were chasing the people who had buried the truth for far too long. They had no idea what awaited them at the church, but one thing was certain. They couldn't stop now. As they made their way back to the church, Jake's mind went over everything they had uncovered. The pieces were starting to fit together, but there were still too many gaps. Who was Michael? Why had he been erased from the family history? And why was it so important that the truth stayed hidden? The road to the church seemed to stretch on forever, but Jake kept his focus. They couldn't afford to be distracted. The girl was relying on him. The truth was close, and he could feel it in the pit of his stomach. They finally arrived at the church, its silhouette dark against the night sky. It seemed quieter this time, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Jake turned to the girl, who stood close behind him. "Stay close," he said quietly, his voice full of urgency. "We go in fast, get what we need, and get out. No mistakes." The girl nodded, determination set on her face. They approached the old church door, and Jake pushed it open, the creaking sound echoing through the still night. Inside, the air felt colder, more oppressive, as if the church itself was alive with secrets. They moved quickly, their footsteps muffled by the worn wooden floors. The altar at the front of the church stood like a monument to the past, its silence heavy with the weight of forgotten history. Jake's eyes scanned the room. They had to find whatever was hidden here. The truth. The final piece. They made their way to the back of the church, where the hidden room had been, and Jake pushed open the door. Inside, it was just as they had left it, dark, silent, filled with forgotten relics. But there was something new. On the floor, half hidden beneath a pile of old cloths, was a small wooden box. Jake knelt down, his fingers brushing the dust off the lid. This was it. The key. The truth. He opened the box, his breath catching as he saw what was inside. The small wooden box creaked as Jake opened it, revealing its contents. Inside, wrapped in old, faded cloth, was a small bundle of papers. Jake carefully unwrapped them, his heart racing as he felt the weight of what he was about to discover. The papers were yellowed with age, the ink fading in places, but they were still legible. Jake spread them out on the floor, his eyes scanning the first page. It was a letter, written in neat handwriting, but the words on the page sent a shiver down his spine. "If you are reading this, it means the truth can no longer be hidden," Jake read aloud, his voice low. The girl stood behind him, her eyes wide with curiosity, but also with a sense of fear. She knew this was the moment when everything they had been searching for would come to light. "This is it," Jake whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He continued reading, his eyes moving quickly over the letter. "The family secret was never meant to be exposed, but the truth is buried deep in the past, in the blood of those who came before us. My name is Michael, and I am the key to understanding everything." Jake's hands trembled as he finished the letter. Michael, the man in the photograph, had written this, and everything they had been through, the danger, the threats, was now tied to him. "It's all connected," Jake muttered, staring at the letter in disbelief. The girl leaned in, her breath catching in her throat. "What does it mean?" she asked softly. Jake turned to her, his face a mix of awe and confusion. "It means that your family was part of something much bigger than we thought," he said, his voice low. "And Michael was trying to protect you. Protect all of us." He scanned the remaining pages, finding more letters, more records, each one revealing more of the tangled web that had been hidden for years. The letters were a mix of history and warning. They spoke of deals made, secrets shared, and the lengths to which people had gone to keep this dark history buried. Michael's last letter, dated just before his disappearance, was the most chilling. "I know the danger I am in," it read, "but I have no choice. I cannot let the truth stay buried. The family's involvement in what happened all those years ago is too great. And now, it is time for the world to know what really happened. No one can be trusted, not even those closest to me. If I do not make it out alive, know this, the truth will find its way to you." Jake folded the letters carefully, his mind spinning. The girl watched him, her eyes filled with fear, but also with a spark of determination. "What now?" she asked. Jake stood up, his resolve firming as he looked at her. "Now we finish this," he said, his voice steady. "Now we make sure Michael's sacrifice wasn't in vain. We expose the truth, and we make sure the people responsible for keeping it buried never get the chance to hide it again." The girl nodded, her face pale, but her eyes shining with something stronger than fear. Jake walked over to the door, his mind made up. He could feel the weight of the truth settling in his chest, heavy but necessary. They couldn't go back. They couldn't undo what had already been uncovered. But they could expose the lies, bring the truth to light, and make sure that no one would ever forget what happened. As they stepped out of the church, the cold night air hit them again, but this time, it felt different. The danger wasn't gone, but they had the upper hand now. They had the truth, and with it, they had power. "We'll take this to the authorities," Jake said, his voice firm. "We'll make sure they hear us." The girl nodded, a quiet strength filling her as she walked beside him. She was no longer just running from the past. She was ready to face it. Together, they walked toward the unknown, but this time, they weren't afraid. They had the truth on their side, and they weren't going to let anyone silence it. Jake knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be obstacles, more danger, and more people who wanted to stop them. But it didn't matter anymore. They had come too far to turn back, and they were about to rewrite history. They were about to make sure that Michael's voice was heard. The truth would come out, no matter what. And that, Jake knew, was all that mattered.